Before the last candle had been extinguished in the grand hall, before the final guest had passed through the iron gates of Blackmore Estate, a whisper in the bridal suite cracked open a door that had been sealed for 3 years. "I know, sweetheart. I know you're scared. But Mommy's going to come get you soon, I promise. Just a little bit longer." The groom stopped breathing. But the child's response, tinny and small through the phone speaker, carved deeper. "Mommy, the lady says the bad man called again. He's asking where you went." Silence. Then, barely a breath. "Listen to me, baby. You don't tell anyone where I am. Not the nice lady. Not anyone. If he finds out Mommy got married, if he finds out where I am, he'll come. And I need you safe. That's all that matters. You understand?" "I understand, Mommy. I love you more than everything. I love you more than everything, too." 10 feet from the bathroom door, standing in the darkness of his own bedroom, a man whose name made prosecutors hesitate and rivals disappear, felt something fracture behind his ribs. Because Theron Marchetti had heard many things in his 43 years. Confessions, threats, the wet sound of loyalty crumbling under pressure. But he had never heard a bride, his bride, whispering to a child she had never mentioned, hiding from a man who was still hunting her. His wife had not married him for love. She had not married him for money. She had married him for cover. And the man she was running from, the one her daughter called the bad man, had no idea what he had just walked into. Because Theron Marchetti did not lose control often. But when he did, empires remembered. Blackmore Estate sat on 40 acres of silence at the edge of Carrick County, where the old money families had once built their summer homes, and the new money families had learned to pretend they'd always belonged. The main house was a 3-storied Georgian manor with limestone walls the color of old bone and windows that watched the driveway like narrow, patient eyes. The wedding had been held in the East Garden. 200 guests, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, an arch woven with pale roses and eucalyptus that trembled faintly in the October wind. But there had been something about the bride that the guests had noticed, even if they couldn't name it. The way she smiled a half-second too late, the way her eyes moved across the crowd, not with joy, but with calculation, scanning faces, lingering on exits. The way she held her bouquet, not like a woman holding flowers, but like a woman holding something she might need to drop at any moment so her hands would be free. No one said anything, of course. One did not comment on the bride at a Marchetti wedding. One simply smiled, applauded at the appropriate moments, and pretended not to notice that the groom's side of the aisle included 3 city council men, a federal judge, and a man who had allegedly made 4 witnesses in a RICO case change their minds overnight. Theron Marchetti was not the kind of man whose wedding you declined. He was the kind of man who had built something vast and intricate across the eastern seaboard. Something that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal, between politics and power, between the world people saw and the world that actually ran things. He was 43 years old. He had dark hair cut short, silver threading through his temples like early frost. His eyes were the color of slate after rain, and they carried a quality that made people feel, inexplicably, that he already knew what they were about to say. He had been married once before. His first wife, Annalise, had died in a car accident 7 years ago. She had been 26 weeks pregnant. Theron had buried them both in a private cemetery on the northeast corner of the estate grounds and had not spoken about either of them since. That was the thing about Blackmore Estate. It looked like a place where beautiful things happened. White weddings, champagne receptions, string quartets playing pachelbel as the sun sank below the tree line. But underneath the limestone and the roses, the estate was something else entirely. It was a place where people buried what they couldn't bear to carry. And secrets, as Theron had learned long ago, were the only currency that never lost its value. Tonight, his bride had just revealed she was richer than he had ever imagined. Leora Vance had learned to disappear long before she learned to survive. She was 31 years old. She had dark brown hair, dyed from her natural auburn the night she ran 3 years ago, kept pinned back in a style that was elegant enough for a Marchetti bride, but practical enough for a woman who might need to run at any moment. Her eyes were green-gray, the color of sea glass worn smooth by years of tumbling, and they had the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning not to flinch, not to react, not to let her face betray what her body already knew. She was beautiful in the way that broken things can be beautiful. Carefully, conditionally, with all the sharp edges turned inward where no one could see them. The wedding dress hung in the closet now, a cascade of ivory silk that had cost more than she'd earned in 2 years at the restaurant where Theron had first seen her. She hadn't chosen it. His people had chosen everything. The flowers, the venue, the guest list, the 4-tier cake she'd barely touched. All she'd had to do was show up, say the words, and sign her name on a marriage certificate that made her, legally, Mrs. Theron Marchetti. What the certificate didn't say was that Leora Vance didn't exist. The woman who had existed before, the one with the real name and the real history, had died on paper 3 years ago. New identity, new documents, new social security number purchased from a man in Delaware who specialized in making people vanish. She had paid him with the last of the money she'd hidden from Bram Hadler, her first husband, the father of her daughter, the man who had broken her collarbone on their first anniversary because she'd burned the rice, the man who had dislocated her shoulder 3 months later because she'd smiled at a waiter, the man who had held her underwater in their bathtub for 37 seconds. She had counted every one because she'd come home 11 minutes late from the grocery store. Bram didn't hit her often. That was the thing people didn't understand about men like him. The hitting wasn't the control. The hitting was just the punctuation. The control was everything else. The constant monitoring, the silent disapproval, the way he could make the air in a room feel thinner just by looking at her a certain way. He had isolated her from her family within the first year. Her mother had stopped calling after Bram told her, with that smile that looked so charming to everyone else that Leora needed space to focus on her marriage. Her college friends had drifted away after enough canceled plans, enough unanswered texts, enough careful excuses delivered in a voice that everyone could tell was lying, but no one wanted to investigate. By the time their daughter Iris was born, Leora had no one left, and Bram had made sure she knew it. "Who would believe you?" he had said once, after she'd threatened to leave. They were standing in the kitchen. Iris was 18 months old, asleep in the next room. "You have no money, no family, no friends. And I'm a respected man, Leora. I'm a deacon at our church. I coach Little League. When you walk into a police station with your stories, who do you think they're going to believe? You or me?" He'd said it calmly, almost kindly. The way you'd explain something to a child who didn't understand how the world worked. And the worst part was that he'd been right. She had tried once. She had gone to the police station when Iris was 2, with photographs of bruises on her ribs and a split lip she'd covered with concealer that didn't quite match her skin. The officer who took her statement had been sympathetic. He'd written everything down. He'd given her a pamphlet about domestic violence resources and said someone would be in touch. And then nothing had happened. No arrest, no charges, not even a follow-up call. Just a visit from Bram 3 days later, smiling at the front door, explaining to a different officer that there had been a misunderstanding and that he and his wife were working things out. The officer who'd taken her original statement was transferred to another precinct the following month. She learned the lesson. Men like Bram didn't just control their wives. They controlled the systems their wives might try to escape through. They had friends in the right places. They knew which hands to shake and which backs to pat. They understood, intuitively, that power wasn't about strength. It was about making sure no one else had any. So Leora had stopped trying to escape through the front door. She had started planning a different kind of exit. It took her 18 months to save enough money without Bram noticing. Small amounts. Cash back at the grocery store, a few dollars at a time. Birthday checks from her grandmother that she pretended to deposit, but actually hid inside a hollowed-out hardcover on the shelf Bram never touched. A secret email account linked to a PayPal he didn't know existed. And then, on a Tuesday night in March, while Bram was at a church council meeting where everyone would see him being the upstanding man he pretended to be, Leora had taken her daughter, walked out of the house with nothing but a backpack and a car seat, and driven until the sun came up. The first year after she ran, Leora had believed she could disappear. She'd driven from Ohio to Kentucky, then to Tennessee, then to a small town in North Carolina where no one knew her name, and the rent was paid in cash. She'd found work at a diner, the kind of place with sticky menus and regulars who called her Han, and didn't ask questions about why a woman with a 3-year-old was living in a motel room with blackout curtains she'd bought at the dollar store. Iris had adjusted the way children do, quickly on the surface, slowly underneath. She'd stopped asking when they were going home after the first month. She'd stopped asking about Daddy after the second. But she'd started having nightmares, the kind where she woke up screaming words that weren't quite words, clutching a stuffed rabbit she'd carried from Ohio, the same rabbit she'd been holding the night she'd stood frozen in the hallway, watching her father's fist connect with her mother's face. Leora would hold her in the dark and whisper promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We're safe now, baby. Mommy's got you. No one's going to find us." But Bram had found them. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, 4 months after she'd left. Leora had taken Iris to a park, a small one with a rusted swing set and a sandbox full of leaves. She'd been pushing Iris on the swing, listening to her daughter laugh, feeling something that might have been hope starting to uncurl in her chest. And then she'd seen the car, a black sedan parked across the street, Ohio plates, the engine running. She couldn't see through the tinted windows, but she didn't need to. She knew. She'd grabbed Iris off the swing so fast her daughter had started crying. She'd walked, not run, because running would confirm she'd seen him, back to the motel, packed everything they owned into 2 garbage bags, and driven through the night until they crossed into Virginia. That was the first time. The second time was in Richmond, 6 months later. She'd gotten a job at a dry cleaner's, found an apartment with a landlord who didn't run background checks, started to let herself breathe again. Then she'd come home one evening and found a note taped to her door. No words, just a photograph. It was a picture of Iris at the playground across from her apartment. Taken that morning, based on the jacket Iris had been wearing. The angle was from a distance, maybe 50 yards, but close enough to see her daughter's face clearly. Close enough to prove that someone had been watching. Leora had packed and left that night. The third time was the worst. She'd been in Delaware for almost a year. Different name, different hair color, a job at a restaurant where the owner paid under the table and didn't ask why she flinched whenever a man raised his voice. She'd enrolled Iris in a preschool run by a woman named Margot, who had kind eyes and a policy of never releasing children to anyone not on the approved list. She'd started to feel, for the first time, like maybe she could build something. Not a life, exactly. She didn't dare call it that. But a structure, a routine, a set of walls that might hold. And then Bram had walked into the restaurant. He hadn't come to her table. He hadn't said a word. He'd simply sat at the counter, ordered a cup of coffee, and watched her work for 45 minutes. His eyes never left her. Not when she took orders. Not when she delivered food. Not when her hands started shaking so badly she dropped a plate, and the cook asked if she was feeling okay. When he finally stood to leave, He'd placed a $20 bill on the counter, far too much for a cup of coffee, and underneath it, a business card. His business card. From the insurance company where he worked as a senior adjuster. On the back, in his neat, precise handwriting, "You can't hide forever, Leora. Iris needs her father." She'd quit that night, pulled Iris out of Margot's preschool at 11 p.m. with an apology she didn't have time to explain. Driven until the sun came up, then kept driving. That was when she'd understood. Bram wasn't just looking for her. He was hunting her. Systematically. Patiently. The way a man hunts something he considers his property. She couldn't outrun him. Not forever. Not with a child. Not with no money and no family and no one who would believe her even if she told them the truth. She needed someone more powerful than him. It had taken her 8 months to find Theron Marchetti. Or rather, to let him find her. She'd done her research. Learned which restaurants he frequented. Learned that he was a widower. Learned that he was, according to the whispered rumors she'd pieced together from gossip columns and courthouse records, the kind of man whose enemies had a habit of reconsidering their positions. She'd gotten a job at the restaurant where he ate dinner every Thursday. She'd made sure to be his server. She'd been beautiful and quiet and just damaged enough to be interesting because she'd learned by then that powerful men were drawn to things that looked like they needed protecting. She hadn't planned to feel anything, but Theron had surprised her. He'd been polite, reserved. He'd tipped generously but never excessively. He'd asked her questions, small ones, about the menu, about her day, and actually listened to the answers. He'd looked at her the way a man looks at a painting in a museum, with appreciation, but without the assumption that he had the right to touch. After 3 months, he'd asked her to dinner. After 6 months, he'd asked her to marry him. She'd said yes, not because she loved him, though something complicated had started to grow in the space where love might eventually live, but because Iris was turning 6, and Bram was getting closer, and Leora had run out of places to hide. She'd said yes because she was tired. She'd said yes because her daughter deserved a door that locked. She'd said yes because Theron Marchetti was the first man in 8 years who had never once made her afraid. And now, standing in the bathroom of the bridal suite with a phone still warm from her daughter's voice, she realized she had made a terrible miscalculation. She had married a man to hide from her past, but she had never told him what she was hiding from, and he had just found out. Theron Marchetti had learned to wait the way predators learn to wait. Without urgency, without impatience, with the absolute certainty that the moment would arrive and he would be ready for it. He stood in the hallway outside the bridal suite for 11 minutes after the phone call ended. He heard the water run in the bathroom. He heard his wife, the word still strange in his mouth, take 3 shaky breaths that she probably thought were silent. He heard the small click of a phone being powered off and slid into a drawer. He did not knock on the door. He did not demand an explanation. He simply walked downstairs to his study, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he did not intend to drink, and began making calls. By midnight, he knew everything. This was the thing about Theron Marchetti that most people misunderstood. They thought his power came from violence, from the men he employed, from the judges and politicians whose careers he had quietly shaped over 2 decades of strategic generosity and even more strategic silence. But that wasn't it. Those were just tools, instruments. His real power was information. He knew things. About everyone. Not because he was curious. Curiosity was inefficient, but because knowledge was the only form of control that didn't require maintenance. You could threaten a man into compliance, but you'd have to keep threatening him. You could buy a man's loyalty, but you'd have to keep paying. But if you knew his secrets, if you knew what he'd done, what he feared, what he loved, what he couldn't afford to lose, then you owned him forever. Quietly. completely, without ever having to raise your voice. By 12:15 a.m., Theron knew about Bram Hadler. By 12:30, he knew about the domestic violence reports that had been filed and mysteriously lost. He knew about the officer who'd been transferred. He knew about the church where Bram served as a deacon and the Little League team he coached. By 1 a.m., he knew about the private investigator Bram had hired 18 months ago. He knew about the searches, the near misses, the photograph left on a door in Richmond. By 1:30, he knew where Iris was. A woman named Colette Breyer, 54 years old, former social worker. Ran an unlicensed foster arrangement out of her home in Marwick, Pennsylvania, for women escaping domestic situations. No paperwork, no records. The kind of place that existed because the official systems had failed so completely that the unofficial ones had to fill the gap. Leora had been paying her $800 a month, nearly half of what she earned, to keep Iris safe and hidden while she built a new identity, found a protector, constructed a life that might one day be stable enough to bring her daughter into. Theron set down the phone. He looked at the wedding photograph on his desk. Taken 6 hours ago, Leora's hand in his, her smile so convincing that even he hadn't seen the fear behind it. And for the first time in many years, Theron Marchetti was not angry. He was something worse. He was impressed. His wife had done what very few people had ever managed. She had deceived him. Successfully. Completely. She had looked him in the eyes and smiled and said, "I do," while carrying a secret so heavy it should have shown in her posture, her voice, the way she held her champagne glass. But it hadn't. She had fooled him. And the only people who could fool Theron Marchetti were people who had been taught by masters. People who had learned, through years of survival, to separate their face from their feelings so completely that even their own heartbeat didn't betray them. Bram Hadler had taught her that. The realization settled into Theron's chest like a stone dropped into deep water. He picked up his phone again. "Sullivan." The voice on the other end was alert despite the hour. Sullivan Cray had worked for Theron for 19 years and had long ago stopped being surprised by late-night calls. "Sir, I need a file on someone, complete, by morning." "Name?" "Bram Hadler, insurance adjuster. Based in Ohio but mobile, has been tracking someone for 3 years." "The target?" Theron paused. He looked at the wedding photograph again. At his wife's green-gray eyes that he now understood were not calm, but controlled. Not peaceful, but vigilant. "My wife," he said quietly. Sullivan was silent for a moment. Then, "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes. Find out where he is right now." "Exactly. And make sure he doesn't move without us knowing." "Consider it done." Theron hung up. He sat alone in his study, in a house that had just become something different than it had been 12 hours ago. He had married a stranger, a woman with secrets, a woman who had used him, deliberately, strategically, as a shield against something she feared more than a man whose name made prosecutors hesitate. He should have been furious. But sitting there in the dark, with his untouched whiskey catching the lamplight, Theron Marchetti felt something else entirely. He felt the door to a room he had sealed long ago begin to crack open. Because he knew what it meant to hide from someone who was supposed to love you. He knew what it cost. Theron Marchetti had been 8 years old the first time his father broke his mother's jaw. He remembered the sound. Not the hit itself. He hadn't seen that. He'd been hiding in the coat closet off the kitchen, behind a wall of wool and mothballs that smelled like his grandmother's house. But he'd heard it. A wet, cracking sound that didn't seem like it could come from a person. And then, silence. And then his mother's voice, quiet and steady, saying, "Theron, stay where you are. Don't come out. Mommy's fine." Mommy was not fine. Mommy's jaw had been wired shut for 6 weeks. She'd eaten through a straw and smiled at him with her eyes and told everyone who asked that she'd fallen down the stairs. His father's name was Vincent Marchetti, and he had been a respected man, a businessman, a philanthropist who donated to children's hospitals and attended charity galas and shook hands with mayors and senators who didn't know, or didn't care, what he did when the cameras weren't watching. Vincent had never hit Theron. That was the thing people didn't understand about men like his father. The violence wasn't random. It was precise, targeted. It went where it would do the most damage with the least visibility. And Theron's mother, Renata, had been the perfect target. She was beautiful. She was quiet. She had no family in America. She'd emigrated from Montenegro at 19, and no friends that Vincent hadn't vetted and approved. She existed in a bubble of isolation so complete that when she finally did try to leave, she discovered what Theron would later come to understand as the machinery of control. There was no money in her name, no car she could legally drive, no credit history, no work experience that would show up on a resume. She had been Mrs. Vincent Marchetti for 16 years, and in all that time, she had accumulated nothing that was hers. She had tried to take Theron and run when he was 11. He remembered that night, the whispered instructions, the single suitcase, the taxi waiting at the end of the driveway at 2 a.m. while his father slept upstairs. They had made it to the bus station. That was all. Vincent's people had found them within 4 hours. Theron remembered being carried back into the house by a man he didn't recognize. He remembered his mother's face. Not crying, not screaming, just empty. Like something behind her eyes had finally given up. She never tried to leave again, and Theron learned, in the years that followed, what it meant to watch someone you love be destroyed slowly. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just piece by piece, day by day, until the woman who used to sing Montenegrin folk songs while she cooked became a ghost who moved through rooms without making sound. She died when Theron was 23. Heart failure, the doctors said. Her body simply stopped. But Theron knew the truth. Her heart hadn't failed. It had been broken so many times it forgot how to keep beating. He had stood at her grave on a gray November afternoon, alone, and made a promise. Not out loud. Not to God or to her memory or to any witness. Just to himself. To the boy who had hidden in the closet. To the child who had heard his mother whisper, "Mommy's fine," through a jaw that was shattered. He had promised that if he ever had the power to protect someone, he would not look away. His father had died 4 years later, a heart attack at 61. The obituary called him a titan of industry, a devoted family man, a pillar of the community. Theron had read it once, folded the newspaper neatly, and never spoken of his father again. But he had kept the promise. In the 20 years since his mother's death, Theron had built something. Not just an organization, not just a network of power and influence, but a system. An invisible infrastructure that existed alongside his business interests, quiet, efficient, unacknowledged. Women who needed to disappear were helped to disappear. Men who needed to be reminded of their vulnerability were reminded. Judges who looked the other way were encouraged to look more carefully. No one knew about this. Not Sullivan. Not the lawyers. Not the politicians who returned his calls. It was his private work, his penance, his promise kept. And now, sitting in his study on his wedding night, Theron understood why he had felt something shift when he'd heard his wife whispering to her hidden daughter. It wasn't anger at being deceived. It wasn't wounded pride. It was recognition. He had heard that voice before. The controlled calm, the careful steadiness. The tone of a woman who had learned to hide her fear so completely that it had become a second skin. His mother had spoken in that voice. Every day. For 16 years. And his wife, Leora, who had married him for protection, who had hidden a child from him, who had run from a man for 3 years without ever letting the terror show on her face. She spoke in that voice too. Theron stood and walked to the window. The grounds of Blackmore Estate spread out beneath him, silver in the moonlight, beautiful and silent and full of buried things. He was not going to look away. Not this time. Leora didn't sleep that night. She lay in the bed she was supposed to share with her new husband, a bed with sheets that probably cost more than 3 months of her old salary, and stared at the ceiling and waited for the door to open. It didn't. At 3 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside the bedroom. Her heart stopped. Her hands gripped the sheets so tightly her knuckles ached. The footsteps continued past. At 5 a.m., she gave up pretending and got out of bed. She pulled on a robe, silk, cream-colored, another thing his people had chosen for her, and walked to the window. The grounds of Blackmore Estate were gray in the pre-dawn light, the trees standing like witnesses at the edge of the lawn. She thought about running. She calculated how long it would take to get to her car, how far she could drive before anyone noticed, how quickly she could get to Marwick, to Colette's house, to Iris. But she already knew the answer. Not far enough. Not fast enough. And if she ran now, if she disappeared on her wedding night, Theron Marchetti would look for her. Not out of love. Out of pride. She had traded one cage for another. The only difference was that this cage had better lighting. "You're awake early." The voice came from behind her. Leora spun around, her hand flying to her throat. Theron stood in the doorway. He was still dressed, the same suit from the wedding, though he'd removed the jacket and loosened the tie. His face was unreadable. His eyes moved across her the way they always did, seeing everything, revealing nothing. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Her voice was steady. She made sure of it. "Neither could I." He walked into the room. Slowly. Not threatening, but not casual either. He stopped 10 feet away from her, his hands in his pockets, his posture deliberately open. "We should talk," he said. "About what?" "About your daughter." The words hit her like ice water. Her vision narrowed. Her hands started to shake, and she couldn't stop them, couldn't control the tremor that ran through her whole body. "I don't. His voice was soft, but the word was a command. "Don't lie to me. Not now. Not about this." Leora's legs gave out. She sat down on the edge of the bed because standing was no longer possible. She stared at the floor and waited for what came next. Anger. Accusations. The particular cruelty of a powerful man who had been deceived. Instead, Theron pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from her. Close enough to talk. Far enough to give her space. "Her name is Iris," he said. "She's 6 years old. She's been living with a woman named Colette Breyer in Marwick, Pennsylvania for the last 14 months. You pay $800 a month for her care. You call her every night at 8:15 from whatever phone you can find that isn't being monitored." Leora looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She had forgotten how to cry years ago. "How do you know that?" "Because I made some calls tonight." "You had me investigated." "I had the situation investigated. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" Theron leaned forward slightly. His elbows rested on his knees. His eyes never left her face. "The difference is that I'm not interested in punishing you. I'm interested in understanding." Leora laughed. The sound was hollow, broken. "Understanding what? That I married you under false pretenses? That I used you? That our entire relationship has been a transaction?" "Yes," Theron said simply. "All of that." "And you're not angry?" "I didn't say that." He stood up. He walked to the window where she had been standing moments before and looked out at the gray dawn. "I'm angry," he said quietly. "But not at you. I'm angry at the situation that made you feel this was your only option. I'm angry that a woman with a child had to marry a stranger for protection because the systems that should have protected her failed completely. I'm angry that a man has been hunting you for 3 years and no one, not the police, not the courts, not anyone, has stopped him. He turned back to face her. I'm angry, Leora, but I'm not angry at you. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. Men who said they weren't angry were always the most dangerous. Men who spoke softly hit the hardest. But something in his face made her hesitate. Something in his eyes that looked less like control and more like recognition. Why aren't you angry at me? She whispered. Theron was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Softer. Older, somehow. Like he was speaking from a room he hadn't entered in a very long time. Because my mother spent 16 years married to a man who did what Bram Hadler does, and she never found anyone willing to help her. She died alone, in a house she couldn't escape, surrounded by people who knew exactly what was happening and chose not to see it. He paused. I couldn't protect her then. I was just a boy. But I'm not a boy anymore. The silence that followed was different from any silence Leora had experienced. It wasn't the silence of waiting for violence. It wasn't the silence of holding your breath. It was the silence of something true being spoken, something that had been locked away for so long it had forgotten how to see daylight. He'll come for me, Leora said finally. Bram, he'll find out I'm here. He'll find out about you, and he won't stop. He doesn't stop. I know what he is. Do you? Do you know that he has friends in law enforcement? That he has a private investigator who's been tracking me for 3 years? That he told everyone I abandoned my daughter? That I'm mentally unstable? That I'm a danger to myself and others? He won't find you. You can't promise that. I'm not promising anything. Theron walked back to the chair and sat down again. I'm telling you a fact. Bram Hadler will not find you. He will not take your daughter. He will not hurt you or anyone under this roof. Not because I'm making a promise, but because I have spent 20 years building something specifically designed to stop men who wear kindness like a mask over something rotting. Leora stared at him. What do you mean? I mean that you're not the first woman I've helped. Leora, you're just the first one I married. And for the first time since she'd run from Ohio with a 3-year-old in her arms and nothing but a backpack full of hope, Leora felt something she had forgotten existed. Not safety. Not yet. But the possibility of it. What happens now? She asked. Theron stood up. He extended his hand toward her, not demanding, not pulling, just offering. Now, he said, you tell me everything. And then we bring your daughter home. They talked until the sun came up. Leora told him everything, not because she trusted him, but because she had nothing left to lose. She told him about the first time Bram hit her, 3 months into their marriage, and the way he'd apologized afterward with such sincerity that she'd almost believed it was an accident. She told him about the escalation, the slaps becoming punches, the punches becoming something worse, the violence becoming so normalized that she'd learned to read his moods the way sailors read weather. She told him about the isolation, how Bram had convinced her, slowly, methodically, that her friends were bad influences, that her mother was toxic, that her coworkers were jealous of their marriage, how he'd removed every person from her life until she existed in a vacuum of his creation, breathing only the air he allowed. She told him about Iris. I got pregnant in our 2nd year of marriage, she said. I was stupid enough to think that a baby might change things, that he wouldn't hurt me anymore if I was carrying his child. She laughed bitterly. He was careful after that. He didn't hit me where it showed, didn't hit me where it might hurt the baby. But he found other ways. Control. Monitoring. He installed tracking software on my phone. He checked the mileage on my car every night. He timed how long it took me to get groceries and demanded explanations if I was 5 minutes late. She looked at the window. The sun was fully up now, golden light spilling across the floor. When Iris was born, I thought I would love her enough to make it bearable. And I did love her. I do. More than anything. But loving her made it worse, not better, because suddenly I wasn't just surviving for myself. I was surviving for her. And I could see. I could see what it was doing to her. The way she flinched at loud noises, the way she watched doorways, the way she learned, at 2 years old, to curl into corners when Daddy was in a bad mood. Her voice cracked. She was learning what I learned. That love looks like control. That kindness comes with conditions. That home is a place where you hold your breath and wait for something to break. Theron listened without interrupting. His face was still. His hands were folded in his lap. But something behind his eyes had hardened into cold, patient fury. I tried to leave once, Leora continued. I went to the police. I had photographs. I had documentation. I actually thought they would help me. She shook her head. The officer who took my statement was transferred a week later. The report disappeared. And Bram came home that night and didn't say a word about it. He just smiled at me across the dinner table and asked if I'd had a nice day. That's when I knew. He had people. Everywhere. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed to protect people like me. She told him about the escape, the 18 months of planning, the cash hidden in hollowed-out books, the secret email account, the night she'd finally run. I left with nothing. A backpack, a car seat, my daughter. I drove until I couldn't drive anymore, and then I kept driving. I actually thought, that if I got far enough away, he'd give up. He didn't. No. She told him about the photograph on the door, about the restaurant in Delaware where Bram had sat and watched her for 45 minutes without saying a word. About the business card with its neat handwriting. You can't hide forever, Leora. That's when I realized I couldn't outrun him, she said. He has too many resources, too much patience, and when he finds us... She stopped. What? Theron asked quietly. Leora looked at him directly for the first time since she'd started talking. When he finds us, he's not going to hurt me. Not at first. He's going to take Iris. He's going to use the courts, the same system that failed me, to get custody. He's going to tell them I'm unstable, that I kidnapped my own daughter, that I'm a danger to her. And they'll believe him, because he's a deacon, and a little league coach, and a respected man. And I'm a woman who ran in the middle of the night with no plan and no money and no proof. She pulled her knees up to her chest. He's going to take my daughter, Theron, and then he's going to make sure I never see her again. That's his goal. That's what this has always been about. Not getting me back. Getting her. Because Iris is the only thing I have left that he can still destroy. Theron stood and walked to the window. The golden morning light caught the silver in his hair. What Bram Hadler is going to find, he said finally, is that the rules he's been playing by no longer apply. He turned to face her. I have lawyers who have never lost a custody case. I have investigators who can document things Bram Hadler thought he'd buried. I have contacts in every courthouse in the Eastern Seaboard who will ensure that the right judges see the right evidence at the right time. He walked toward her, slowly, deliberately. And I have something else. A network of people. Women who have been where you are, who got out because someone helped them, who will testify about who he really is. Not because I'm paying them, because they want to. Because they've been waiting for someone to finally listen. He stopped in front of her. Your daughter is coming home, Leora. Not someday. Now. And Bram Hadler is going to learn what happens when he picks a fight with someone who doesn't play by his rules. Leora looked up at him. Her eyes were wet. Her hands were shaking. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? I lied to you. I used you. I married you for protection, not for love. Because I made a promise. His voice was soft, but underneath the softness was something immovable. 35 years ago, I made a vow at my mother's grave. I swore that if I ever had the power to stop someone like Bram Hadler, I would. Not for recognition, not for gratitude, because someone should have helped her and no one did. He extended his hand again. I'm not going to look away. This time, Leora took it. Things moved faster than Leora had thought possible. Within 24 hours, Sullivan Cray had compiled a file on Bram Hadler that ran to 147 pages. Every address he'd lived at, every job he'd held, every woman he'd dated before Leora. 3 of them, it turned out, all of whom had moved to different states within a year of ending their relationships with him, and 2 of whom had filed police reports that had mysteriously disappeared. Sullivan had also located 6 former colleagues from Bram's insurance company who were willing to provide statements about his temper issues. A neighbor from his current apartment building who had heard shouting through the walls. A church volunteer who had once seen him grab a Little League player's arm hard enough to leave bruises. An incident that had been quietly forgotten after Bram made a generous donation to the youth ministry fund. The picture that emerged was not of a respected man with a troubled ex-wife. It was of a predator who had spent decades perfecting his camouflage. Within 48 hours, Theron's lawyers, a team of 4, led by a woman named Vivian Ashford, who had a voice like a scalpel and a reputation that made opposing counsel request continuances, had filed an emergency petition in family court. The petition documented Bram's history of violence. It included medical records, police reports, the ones that hadn't been destroyed, witness statements, and a psychological evaluation that painted a portrait of a man with narcissistic personality disorder and a documented pattern of controlling behavior. It also included a formal request for Leora to be granted full custody of Iris, with supervised visitation rights for Bram, supervised by a court-appointed monitor in a public facility, with no overnight stays. The judge who received the petition was named Harold Kemper. He was 63 years old, a former prosecutor, and had a reputation for being unmoved by wealth or influence. He was also someone who had, 15 years ago, received an anonymous tip that had helped him convict a man who had murdered his ex-wife. The tip had come through channels that were never traced, but Harold Kemper had always suspected it had come from someone with resources and reach beyond ordinary law enforcement. He had never been able to prove who had sent it. But when a petition crossed his desk with Theron Marchetti's law firm listed as counsel, he read it very carefully. Within 72 hours, the petition was approved. Within 96 hours, Bram Hadler was served at his office in Columbus, Ohio. The papers included a restraining order, a summons to family court, and a letter from Vivian Ashford that explained, in precise legal language, that any attempt to contact Leora, her daughter, or anyone associated with the Marchetti household would result in immediate criminal charges. Bram called his own lawyer. His lawyer read the documentation. Then his lawyer called him back and suggested, in the strongest possible terms, that Bram not fight this. They have everything, the lawyer said. Every woman you've ever dated. Every incident that was supposed to be buried. If this goes to trial, you won't just lose custody. You'll lose your job, your reputation, and probably your freedom. 2 days later, Bram Hadler signed a consent agreement. He relinquished all custody rights to Iris. He agreed to pay child support but would have no visitation privileges. He agreed to stay at least 500 feet from Leora, Iris, and any property associated with the Marchetti family. He signed it without negotiation. Because the alternative, the thing he'd read about on the internet, the whispered stories, the men who had tried to cross Theron Marchetti and found their lives unraveling in ways that couldn't be traced, was worse. On the 7th day after her wedding, Leora drove to Marwick, Pennsylvania. Theron came with her. He didn't ask permission. He simply got in the car, sat in the passenger seat, and said, "You shouldn't do this alone." The drive took 4 hours. Neither of them spoke much. But somewhere around the halfway point, Leora reached across the center console and took his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Colette Breyer's house was a small yellow farmhouse at the end of a dirt road, with a wraparound porch and a tire swing hanging from an oak tree in the front yard. Wind chimes clinked gently in the breeze. Leora got out of the car. Her legs were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The front door opened, and there she was. Iris, 6 years old. Auburn hair that matched Leora's natural color. Green-gray eyes. A small, serious face that broke into something radiant when she saw who was standing in the driveway. "Mommy?" The word was a question and a prayer and a sob all at once. "Mommy!" Iris ran. She flew off the porch and across the yard and launched herself into Leora's arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. Leora held her. She held her daughter the way she had dreamed of holding her for 14 months, not through a phone, not through whispered promises, but here, now, real, solid, warm, alive. "I'm here, baby," she whispered into Iris's hair. "I'm here. Mommy's here. And I'm never letting go again." Behind them, standing by the car, Theron Marchetti watched. And for the first time since his mother's funeral 20 years ago, he felt something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was hope. 3 months later, on a January afternoon cold enough to turn breath to silver, a black car pulled through the gates of Blackmore Estate. The grounds were dusted with snow. The oak trees stood bare against the gray sky, their branches reaching upward like hands waiting to catch something that hadn't fallen yet. Smoke curled from the chimney. Iris climbed out of the car first. She was bundled in a purple coat with a faux fur hood, a Christmas gift from Theron that she had refused to take off for 3 days after receiving it. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her eyes were bright. She had changed in the 3 months since coming to Blackmore. Not dramatically. She was still quiet, still watchful. But there was something different now. A looseness in her shoulders, a quickness to her smile. She had started calling Theron by his name instead of the tall man. That had happened 6 weeks ago, at breakfast. Theron had been reading the newspaper. Iris had been eating waffles, her new favorite food. She had looked up, syrup on her chin, and said, "Theron, can I have more orange juice?" Leora had frozen. Theron had lowered his newspaper, looked at the 6-year-old and said, "Of course you can." Then he had poured her orange juice, returned to his newspaper, and said nothing else. But Leora had seen his hands. They were shaking. Now Iris ran up the front steps with the easy confidence of a child who had learned that this place was safe. The door opened before she reached it. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, who had become Iris's most devoted guardian. "There's my girl," Mrs. Aldridge said. "You're half frozen. Come inside. Can we build a snowman later? After you've warmed up? Can Theron help?" Mrs. Aldridge glanced at Theron and permitted herself a small smile. "I suspect he can be persuaded." Iris disappeared into the house. Leora stood on the front porch and watched her go. "She's happy," she said quietly. "She's home," Theron replied. Leora turned to look at him. 3 months had changed things between them. The transaction had become something else, something that didn't have a name yet, but was growing in the spaces between them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Iris made this at school," she said. It was a drawing, crayon on construction paper. 3 figures standing in front of a large house. The tallest figure had dark hair with gray at the temples. The medium figure had brown hair. The smallest figure had a purple coat and was smiling so wide her face could barely contain it. Above them, in wobbly 6-year-old letters, Iris had written a single word: family. Theron looked at the drawing for a long time. "She's never written that word before," Leora said softly. "I asked her why she wrote it now." "What did she say?" "She said, because it's true now. Before it wasn't true. Now it is." Theron carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his jacket pocket, against his heart. "She's right," he said. Somewhere in Ohio, in an apartment that felt smaller every day, Bram Hadler sat alone in the dark. He had lost his job the previous month. His church had quietly asked him to step down from the council. His name had become a whisper, the wrong kind. He had spent his entire life believing that power meant making others powerless. He had never considered that someone might play the game better than him. Now he knew. Later that evening, after the snowman had been built, after dinner, after Iris had been tucked into bed in the room with purple walls and the star-shaped nightlight, Leora found Theron in his study. He was standing at the window looking out at the snow-covered grounds. On his desk was a photograph she had never seen before. A woman, dark hair, kind eyes, a smile that looked like it was trying to be brave. "Your mother?" Leora asked. "Renata." Leora looked at the photograph, at the woman who had died in a house she couldn't escape. "She would be proud of you," Leora said. "I don't know about that." "I do." Theron finally turned. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not quite, but close. "I spent 20 years building something I thought was about power," he said quietly. "Control, making sure no one could hurt me the way my father hurt her. And then you walked into that restaurant and I thought I was saving you." He paused. "But you saved me too. You and Iris. You reminded me why I built any of it in the first place." Leora crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close enough to feel his warmth. "I didn't marry you for love," she said. "I know. But I think—" She hesitated. "I think I might be learning how." "I think I might be learning too," he said. She kissed him. Not the way she'd kissed him on their wedding day. A performance. A transaction. This was different. This was a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, Theron rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" Leora asked. Theron smiled. A real smile. "Now," he said, "we live." At Blackmore Estate, in a room with purple walls and a star-shaped nightlight, a 6-year-old girl slept peacefully. She dreamed of snowmen and waffles, and a tall man who poured orange juice without being asked. She dreamed of a mother who didn't look over her shoulder anymore. She dreamed of a house with a door that locked from the inside. And on her nightstand, next to a glass of water and a well-loved stuffed rabbit that had traveled with her from Ohio to Kentucky to Virginia to Delaware to Pennsylvania to here, sat a piece of paper. Another drawing. It showed the same 3 figures: the tall man, the mother, the girl in the purple coat. But this time, there was something new. Above the house, in crayon letters, Iris had written 2 words: the end. But she had crossed out end and written something else beside it: the beginning. And somewhere, in the quiet of a winter night, in a house full of secrets that had finally been told, a family was sleeping, not running, not hiding, not waiting for something to break, just sleeping. Finally, together.